It was a quiet evening in the suburbs, the kind of night where the air feels thick with the promise of stillness. The streetlights cast their warm glow on the sidewalks, and the occasional hum of passing cars blended into the background like a lullaby. For Mariah, it was her favorite time of day, a chance to unwind after a long shift at the veterinary clinic. She walked her dog, Duke, a massive yet gentle Rottweiler, along their usual path, soaking in the calm of the night. Duke trotted confidently beside her, his leash loose, his powerful frame moving with an easy rhythm. Maria had always been a private person. She kept her world small, close-knit. At 28, she had faced her share of challenges, but her quiet strength and unyielding resolve made her stand out to those who knew her. Duke, her fiercely loyal companion, had been her constant in a world that sometimes felt unpredictable. To her, he was more than just a dog, he was family. But tonight wasn't like the others. Unseen eyes followed her from the shadows, and hushed whispers carried through the night air. A group of men stood huddled near a corner, their laughter low but sharp, laced with malice. They had been watching Mariah for weeks, waiting for the right moment, emboldened by a toxic mix of prejudice and entitlement. These weren't just petty criminals. They were a gang that thrived on intimidation, seeking out vulnerable targets to assert their dominance. And in their ignorance, they had decided Mariah fit the profile. What they didn't realize was that Maria wasn't like anyone they'd encountered before. As Maria rounded the corner, the men stepped out, blocking her path. Their faces held a cruel confidence, their words dripping with venomous intent. Duke's posture shifted instantly, his muscles tensed, his ears perked, and a low growl rumbled deep in his chest. It was a sound that spoke volumes, a primal warning that cut through the gang's mockery. Maria tightened her grip on Duke's leash, her heart pounding, but she didn't back down. Years of navigating a world that often underestimated her had taught her how to stand her ground. And Duke, sensing her unease, moved closer, his massive frame a shield of unwavering loyalty. One of the men laughed, stepping forward as if to test the waters. "What's a dog gonna do, huh? Ain't no beast gonna scare us," he sneered, his arrogance masking a flicker of doubt. But Duke wasn't just any dog. The air seemed to shift, heavy with an unspoken tension. Mariah's voice, steady despite the situation, broke the silence. "You have no idea what you're walking into," she said, her eyes locked on the men, her voice carrying a quiet intensity. And then it happened. Before anyone could process the shift in the atmosphere, Duke took a step forward, his growl deepening into a roar that echoed through the street. It wasn't just a sound, it was a statement. What happened next would change everything, for Mariah, for Duke, and for the gang who had so tragically underestimated them. The street seemed to hold its breath as Duke stood his ground, his massive frame radiating an energy that was both protective and menacing. The gang, caught between their bravado and an undeniable instinct to tread carefully, exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected fear, maybe pleading, but not this, a woman who didn't flinch and a dog who seemed to embody every ounce of her unshakable resolve. Maria could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she kept her expression steady. Inside, she was calculating. Her years of working with animals had taught her the power of body language, the subtle cues that could de-escalate, or ignite, a confrontation. She knew Duke was in tune with her every move, waiting for her lead. The man closest to her, the one who had laughed earlier, stepped back slightly, his confidence waning. Another, taller and with a sharper edge in his voice, barked at him, "Don't be stupid. It's just a dog. Handle it." Duke's growl deepened, the sound vibrating through the ground beneath them. His dark eyes locked onto the men, unblinking and steady. a silent promise that he wouldn't hesitate if they took one step closer. Maria's hand tightened on the leash, not to restrain Duke, but to remind him that she was in control. The tension hung thick in the air, and Maria took a slow, deliberate breath. But just a dog was the first mistake they'd made tonight. She needed to buy time to think. She wasn't sure how far these men were willing to go, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let them see even a flicker of fear. Scarface hesitated for the briefest moment, and Maria saw it. The flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then, as if to prove something to himself and his crew, he took another step forward, his hand reaching into his pocket. Duke's reaction was immediate. His bark erupted like a thunderclap, sharp and commanding, a sound that sent shivers down Maria's spine, even though she was used to it. The men flinched, their confidence crumbling under the weight of the dog's presence. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Maria's heart pounded in her chest, and she tightened her grip on Duke's leash, ready for anything. The street, so still moments ago, now buzzed with tension, every shadow and sound amplified. Scarface took one more step, but his hand didn't emerge from his pocket. Instead, he stopped, staring at Duke as if realizing for the first time what he was up against. The other men were already retreating, their bravado replaced with murmurs of uncertainty. "This isn't over," Scarface muttered, his voice low and laced with anger. But he turned and walked away, his crew following close behind. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said, her voice calm but firm, "but you're making a mistake." The leader of the group, the tall one with a scar running down his cheek, sneered at her. "Mistake? Lady, you don't get to tell us what's a mistake. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time." Maria's eyes flicked to the other men, noting the way they shifted uncomfortably. They were tough on the surface, but their postures betrayed hesitation. The scar-faced man was the one holding them together, the one they followed. If she could get inside his head, make him question himself, it might give her an opening. Duke took a step forward, his growl never wavering. The men instinctively moved back, a small but telling victory. Scarface glared at Duke, then at Mariah. "What, you think that mutt's gonna save you?" Maria tilted her head slightly, a flicker of a smile playing on her lips. "He's not just a dog," she said softly, her words laced with a quiet confidence. And he wasn't. Duke wasn't the kind of dog you found at the local pound or in a backyard breeder's kennel. He had a story of his own, one that was as much about survival and loyalty as Mariah's. 2 years ago, Maria had found Duke at the animal shelter where she volunteered. He was brought in after being rescued from a fighting ring, a massive, battle-scarred Rottweiler with eyes that told 1,000 stories of pain and resilience. Many had written him off as dangerous, untrainable, but Maria saw something different. She saw the potential for love, for trust, for redemption. It hadn't been easy. The first few months were a battle of wills, as Duke struggled to let go of the fear and aggression that had been forced into him. But Maria's patience and kindness broke through the walls he had built. Slowly, Duke began to trust her, and in return, he became her protector, her shadow, her unwavering guardian. Now, standing on that dimly lit street, Maria knew Duke wasn't just defending her. He was defending the bond they had built, the second chance they had given each other. The scar-faced man took a step closer, but Maria didn't move. Her gaze met his, steady and unyielding. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice low. One of the other men, younger and clearly less sure of himself, shifted nervously. "Maybe we should just go," he muttered, glancing at Duke. "That dog looks like he'd rip us apart." Scarface whipped around, glaring at the younger man. "Shut up. We're not running from some woman and her mutt." But the cracks were showing. Mariah could see it in the way the group fidgeted, the way they avoided meeting Duke's gaze. Fear was creeping in, and fear was a powerful thing. "Listen to your friend," Maria said, her tone calm but insistent. "This doesn't have to go any further. Walk away." Maria stood still, her breath catching in her throat as she watched them disappear into the night. Duke remained alert, his growl fading but his posture still tense, ready to spring into action if needed. When the street was finally quiet again, Maria knelt down, placing a steady hand on Duke's head. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. Duke looked up at her, his eyes softening, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe. But even as the immediate danger passed, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Scarface's parting words echoed in her mind, a promise that hung in the air like a storm cloud. She glanced around the empty street, her senses heightened, and started walking back home. Duke stayed close, his presence as steady and reassuring as ever. Maria knew they had won the night, but something told her the battle was far from over. The walk back home felt longer than usual. The adrenaline that had surged through Maria's veins was beginning to fade, leaving her with a heaviness in her chest. Duke stayed close, his massive form brushing against her leg with every step, as if to remind her he was still there, still watching. She reached down to give his head a quick scratch, a silent thank you for standing by her when it mattered most. Her house came into view, a small, cozy space tucked away at the end of the street. The porch light flickered faintly, casting just enough illumination to cut through the darkness. Maria unlocked the door, her hands trembling slightly, and stepped inside, flipping the switch to flood the living room with light. Duke followed, his nails clicking softly against the wooden floor. Maria locked the door behind her, double-checking it before peering through the curtains to make sure no one was lingering outside. The street was quiet, empty. But that didn't ease the unease settling deep in her gut. She leaned against the door for a moment, her mind replaying the confrontation. Who were those men? They hadn't just stumbled upon her by accident. She was sure of it. The way they watched her, the confidence they had when they blocked her path, it felt calculated. And that scar-faced man, the one who seemed to be their leader, hadn't spoken like someone ready to let things go. Maria shook her head and pushed herself off the door. Worrying wouldn't solve anything tonight. She needed to focus on what she could control, starting with making sure her home was secure. She checked every window and door, her movements methodical. Duke followed her from room to room, his ears perked, his eyes scanning the spaces as if he too felt the weight of the night. Once she was satisfied, Maria collapsed onto the couch, her body heavy with exhaustion. Duke jumped up beside her, resting his head on her lap. She ran her fingers through his fur, taking comfort in the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Good boy," she whispered again, her voice softer now. Duke tilted his head up, his dark eyes meeting hers, and she felt a swell of gratitude. He had been her rock tonight, her shield. But even Duke couldn't protect her from the thoughts racing through her mind. The next day, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. At work, every time the bell above the clinic door chimed, her heart skipped a beat. She tried to focus on her patients, an endless stream of cats, dogs, and the occasional rabbit. But her mind kept drifting back to the night before. When her shift ended, she decided to take a different route home, weaving through streets she didn't normally travel. She kept an eye on the cars behind her, watching for anything suspicious. Duke, sitting in the passenger seat, seemed to sense her unease. His head was on a swivel, his gaze sharp and alert. When she finally pulled into her driveway, Maria breathed a sigh of relief. But the relief was short-lived. As she stepped out of the car, she noticed something odd, a piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. Her stomach tightened as she pulled it free and unfolded it. The note was short, scrawled in messy handwriting. Asterisk where not done asterisk. Maria's pulse quickened. She looked around, but the street was empty. No cars, no people, just the eerie quiet of the late afternoon. She crumpled the note in her hand, fighting the urge to panic. Inside the house, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the note. Duke sat at her feet, his head resting on her knee. Maria felt a wave of frustration and fear. She didn't want to let these men intimidate her, but she couldn't ignore the fact that they had gone out of their way to send a message. She debated calling the police, but what would she say? A vague threat written on a piece of paper wasn't exactly concrete evidence, and she doubted it would get much attention. Still, the thought lingered in her mind as she tried to think of her next move. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every noise outside made her sit up in bed, her heart racing. Duke slept at the foot of the bed, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. Maria kept the crumpled note on her nightstand, a reminder that this wasn't just her imagination. Over the next few days, Maria tried to go about her routine as normally as possible, but the tension never left her. At the clinic, she found herself looking over her shoulder more often, her nerves fraying. Even her coworkers noticed her unease, though she brushed off their concerns with a forced smile. The final straw came one evening when she returned home to find her mailbox open and empty. She knew she hadn't checked the mail that day, and the sight of the open box sent a chill down her spine. Someone had been there, someone bold enough to come onto her property. Maria decided it was time to take action. She dug through her desk drawer and pulled out a small camera she had bought months ago but never set up. She spent the evening installing it outside, pointing it at her driveway and front door. If they came back, she would have proof. But even as she took these precautions, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something bigger than herself. The note, the open mailbox, they were warnings, sure, but they also felt like bait, like the gang was trying to provoke her into a reaction. And what scared her most was the thought that they might not stop with threats. Duke seemed to sense the shift in her energy. He stayed closer than ever, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. When Maria took him for walks, he was more alert, his ears perked and his muscles tense. She trusted him implicitly, but she also knew that even Duke couldn't anticipate everything. As the days stretched on, Maria's fear began to harden into resolve. She refused to let these men control her life, to make her a prisoner in her own home. If they thought they could scare her into submission, they didn't know who they were dealing with. But deep down, Maria couldn't ignore the question that had been nagging at her since that first night. Why her? What did they want, and how far were they willing to go to get it? The answers, she knew, were out there, waiting in the shadows, just beyond her reach. And she was determined to find them, no matter what it took. Would you like me to keep building on this tension, or explore a specific angle further? The night was unusually still, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Maria sat in her living room, every light in the house turned on, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She had spent the last hour scrolling through security camera footage, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. So far, nothing. Just Duke occasionally wandering into frame, his shadowy form moving like a sentinel on patrol. She glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. The weight of exhaustion tugged at her, but her mind refused to rest. The note, the open mailbox, the feeling of being watched, it all pressed down on her, making it impossible to relax. Duke lay stretched out by the front door, his ears twitching even in sleep, as if he too was on edge. The sound of a car engine broke the silence, faint but distinct. Maria froze, her heart pounding as she moved to the window. Carefully, she peeped through the curtain. A dark sedan was parked across the street, its engine idling, headlights off. She watched, her breath shallow, as the driver's door opened and a figure stepped out. The man was tall, his face obscured by a hood, but she recognized the posture, the way he carried himself. Scarface. Maria's stomach twisted. She turned to Duke, who was already on his feet, his head tilted, ears pointed forward. He growled low in his throat, the sound barely audible but full of warning. The man didn't approach the house immediately. Instead, he stood by the car, looking around as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Then, with a deliberate slowness, he started walking toward Maria's driveway. Maria's pulse raced. She reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, almost too calm, as Maria whispered her situation, her eyes never leaving the window. "There's someone outside my house," she said, her voice trembling. "I think he's dangerous. Please send someone quickly." The operator assured her that help was on the way, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was on her own for now. She put the phone down but kept it within reach, her other hand moving to Duke's collar. He was tense, his entire body coiled like a spring, ready to protect her at a moment's notice. Outside, Scarface stopped at the edge of the driveway. He stood there, staring at the house, his face partially illuminated by the glow of a nearby street lamp. Maria's stomach churned as she saw him reach into his jacket and pull something out, a flashlight. He pointed it toward the house, the beam of light sweeping across the front door and windows. Maria's mind raced. What was he doing? Was he alone? She scanned the street, her eyes darting to the sedan. The passenger door opened, and another man stepped out, smaller but no less threatening. They were testing her, she realized. Pushing boundaries, seeing how far they could go before she broke. Duke let out a bark, sharp and commanding, his body pressing against the door, as if daring them to come closer. The sound echoed through the night, causing Scarface to pause. He exchanged a glance with his companion, their movements hesitant. But they didn't leave. Instead, Scarface took a step forward, his flashlight now fixed on the camera Mariah had installed. He smirked, and even from inside the house, Maria could see the mockery in his expression. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to think clearly. She opened the camera app on her phone, pulling up the live feed. The men's faces were clear, their movements captured in sharp detail. She hit the record button, documenting everything. For a moment, Scarface seemed to lose interest in the camera. He turned his attention back to the house, his smirk fading into something colder, more calculating. He gestured to his companion, and they started walking toward the front door. Maria's breath caught. She tightened her grip on Duke's collar, her mind racing with possibilities. Could she hold them off until the police arrived? What if they tried to force their way in? Duke barked again, louder this time, his growl reverberating through the house. The men stopped, their confidence faltering for just a moment. And then, as if to prove they weren't intimidated, Scarface bent down and picked up a rock from the driveway. He tossed it lightly in his hand, testing its weight, before hurling it at the front door. The sound of impact was deafening, shattering the fragile silence of the night. Maria flinched, but Duke didn't. He lunged toward the door, his barks growing more ferocious, his body straining against Mariah's hold. She grabbed her phone again, updating the 911 operator in a frantic whisper. "They're trying to get in," she said, her voice shaking. "They threw something at my door." The operator's voice remained calm, but Mariah could hear the urgency in her words as she assured her that officers were on their way. Outside, the men exchanged a few more words that Mariah couldn't hear. Scarface laughed, a low, menacing sound, before gesturing for his companion to follow him back to the car. Maria watched as they climbed in, the engine roaring to life. But they didn't leave. The sedan stayed parked across the street, its occupants now hidden behind the tinted windows. Maria felt a mix of relief and dread. They had retreated for now, but their presence was still a threat, a reminder that they were watching, waiting. Minutes felt like hours as Maria stayed by the window, Duke at her side. Finally, the flashing lights of a patrol car illuminated the street, and the sedan sped off, disappearing into the night. The officers knocked on her door moments later, their questions coming fast. Maria explained everything, showing them the video footage and describing the men in detail. They assured her they would patrol the area and keep an eye out, but their words felt hollow. As the officers left, Maria stood in the doorway, her hand resting on Duke's head. The street was quiet again, but the tension lingered, heavy and unrelenting. She knew this wasn't over. Scarface and his crew were still out there, and their message was clear. They weren't going to stop. Maria closed the door, locking it behind her. Duke leaned against her, his presence grounding her in the moment. They had pushed her to the edge tonight, but Maria wasn't about to let them win. She had faced challenges before, battles that tested her strength and resolve, and this would be no different. As she looked down at Duke, his unwavering loyalty shining in his eyes, she felt a spark of determination. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Would you like me to continue building toward the climax or explore another angle of the story? The next morning, Maria woke up to find her front yard in disarray. Trash cans overturned, the garden she had so carefully tended trampled, and broken shards of glass scattered near the mailbox. Her stomach sank as she stepped outside, her eyes scanning for any sign of the culprits. Duke followed close behind, his nose to the ground, sniffing at the unfamiliar scent lingering in the air. Maria's neighbors hadn't mentioned hearing anything unusual during the night, but she wasn't surprised. Whoever was behind this was methodical, striking when the street was at its quietest. She grabbed a broom to clean up the mess, her mind racing with questions. Why escalate things now? They had made their presence known already. Was this some kind of retaliation for the police showing up? As she swept up the glass, Maria noticed something tucked into the bushes near her porch. A small folded piece of paper, similar to the one she had found on her windshield days earlier. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and unfolded it, her heart sinking as she read the message. Asterisk, you can't hide forever, asterisk. She stared at the words, her mind a whirlwind of fear and anger. They were trying to break her, to make her feel isolated and vulnerable. But what they didn't know was that Maria wasn't the type to back down. Not anymore. That evening, as she reviewed the security footage again, something caught her attention. A shadowy figure moving across the yard, staying just out of reach of the cameras. They had been careful, but not careful enough. Maria rewound the footage, pausing when the figure turned slightly, giving her a glimpse of their face. It wasn't Scarface. Her chest tightened as she realized this wasn't just his gang. There were others involved, people she hadn't anticipated. The figure disappeared out of frame, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than petty intimidation. It was organized, deliberate. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was an unknown number. Maria hesitated before answering, her voice cautious. Hello. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low, gravelly voice. You think you're smart, don't you? Putting up cameras, calling the cops. But it won't help you. Maria's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? The caller chuckled, a sound that sent chills down her spine. You'll find out soon enough. The line went dead, leaving Maria standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the walls closing in, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. But instead of succumbing to fear, she felt a spark of defiance. If they wanted to scare her, they were going to have to try harder. She called a friend, a tech-savvy coworker who had mentioned his hobby of building home security systems. Within an hour, he was at her house, installing additional cameras and motion sensors. They worked late into the night, Duke pacing nearby, his presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone. By the time her friend left, Maria felt a small sense of relief. The cameras would provide better coverage, capturing anything, or anyone, who approached her property. But the feeling was short-lived. The second plot twist came the following night. Maria had just settled onto the couch, Duke by her side, when her phone buzzed with a notification from the news system. She opened the app, her heart racing as the live feed loaded. What she saw made her blood run cold. Two figures were in her backyard, moving with purpose. One of them carried what looked like a crowbar, while the other shined a flashlight into the windows, peering inside. Maria's hands trembled as she dialed 911, her voice urgent as she relayed the situation. Duke growled, sensing the tension in the air. Maria kept her eyes on the screen, watching as the intruders moved closer to the back door. The sound of their voices, faint but audible, filtered through the camera's microphone. "She's in there," one of them said. "Good," the other replied. "Let's teach her a lesson." Maria's heart raced as she grabbed a heavy flashlight and positioned herself near the door. Duke stood beside her, his stance protective, his growls growing louder. The minutes stretched endlessly as she waited for the sound of sirens, the presence of the police. The men jiggled the handle of the back door, testing it. Maria's grip on the flashlight tightened. Duke barked, a deep thunderous sound that echoed through the house, startling the intruders. "Let's go," one of them hissed. "No," the other said, more stubborn. "We finish this." The tension was unbearable, the stakes higher than ever. And just when Mariah thought things couldn't escalate further, the unmistakable sound of breaking glass shattered the air. Would you like me to continue with the rising tension or explore another aspect of the story? The sound of shattering glass jolted Mariah into action. Her mind raced as adrenaline surged through her veins, sharpening her senses. Duke was already at the broken window, barking furiously, his powerful presence making it clear that crossing into the house would not go unchallenged. Maria's hand hovered over her phone, the 911 call still active, her voice firm as she updated the dispatcher. "They're trying to break in," she said, her tone a mix of fear and determination. "Please hurry." The intruders hesitated just outside the shattered window, their movements uncertain. The sound of Duke's growl, low and menacing, seemed to unnerve them. For a moment, it looked like they might retreat, but then one of them stepped forward, emboldened by the crowbar in his hand. Mariah clenched her fists, her mind racing through her options. She wasn't about to let them inside, not without a fight. Grabbing a can of pepper spray from the nearby counter, she positioned herself near the doorway, ready to protect herself and her home. The man with the crowbar climbed through the broken window, his movements slow and deliberate. He barely had time to land on the floor before Duke lunged at him, teeth bared. The man stumbled back, the crowbar slipping from his grasp as he tried to shield himself from Duke's relentless assault. "Get him off me," the man yelled, his voice panicked. The second intruder hesitated, clearly torn between helping his partner and fleeing. Mariah took advantage of the moment, stepping into view with the pepper spray in hand. "Get out of my house," she shouted, her voice steady despite the chaos. The second man raised his hands, backing away. "We didn't mean." "Don't even try it," Mariah cut him off, her eyes blazing. Before the situation could escalate further, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, signaling the arrival of the police. The second man bolted, disappearing into the darkness, but the man on the floor wasn't so lucky. Duke had him pinned, his growls a constant reminder of the consequences of his actions. The officers entered the house moments later, guns drawn, their presence a welcome relief. They quickly apprehended the intruder, cuffing him and hauling him to his feet. Maria explained everything, her voice trembling as she recounted the events. She showed them the security footage, the broken window, and the threatening note she had found earlier. The officers nodded, their expressions serious as they assured her they would do everything in their power to catch the second man and bring the gang to justice. As they led the captured intruder out to the patrol car, Maria felt a mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and lingering fear. Duke sat by her side, his head resting on her lap, his loyalty and courage a source of comfort. But just as she thought it was over, her phone buzzed with a notification. Another alert from the security system. Her stomach dropped as she opened the app, her eyes widening at what she saw. The dark sedan was back, parked down the street, its engine idling. The silhouette of a figure sat in the driver's seat, watching the scene unfold from a distance. Maria's pulse quickened. She stepped outside, the cold night air biting at her skin as she stared down the car. The officers noticed her reaction and followed her gaze, their hands moving to their holsters. But before anyone could approach, the car sped off, its tires screeching against the pavement. Maria stood there, her breath visible in the chilly air, her mind racing with questions. The officers assured her they would patrol the area and keep her informed, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Scarface and his crew might have been scattered for now, but their message was clear: they weren't finished. As she locked the door behind her, Duke by her side, Maria felt a renewed sense of determination. They had underestimated her, thinking they could break her spirit, but she wasn't about to let fear dictate her life. With Duke as her protector and her own resilience as her shield, she was ready for whatever came next. The night ended with the house quiet again, the broken glass swept away, and the security cameras capturing every angle. But in the stillness, Maria couldn't help but wonder, what was their next move? And would she be ready when the time came? Would you like me to explore what happens next, or develop a different twist for a future encounter? As the hours stretched on, Maria sat in her living room, exhaustion weighing heavily on her, but her mind refusing to rest. Duke was curled up at her feet, his eyes occasionally flickering open to scan the room before closing again. The events of the night replayed in her head like a broken record: the breaking glass, the intruders, the dark Satan speeding off into the night. It felt surreal, like she was trapped in someone else's nightmare. But it was over, at least for now. The police had stayed in the neighborhood for hours, their presence a small comfort. They promised to increase patrols and reassured her they'd find the rest of the gang. But Maria couldn't rely solely on their words. She had learned long ago that protecting herself meant taking matters into her own hands when necessary. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight casting a warm glow across her home, Maria felt a flicker of hope. This house was her sanctuary, her fresh start. She wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. Over the next few days, she made changes. She reinforced her windows with shatterproof film and installed stronger locks on every door. Her friend helped upgrade her security system even further, adding alarms that would trigger at the first sign of an intruder. Duke seemed to sense the shift in her determination, his protective instincts stronger than ever. He rarely left her side, and every time his ears perked up at a sound outside, she knew he was watching over her. The police followed up regularly, updating her on their progress. They'd apprehended the second intruder, the one who had run off that night. He wasn't willing to give up Scarface or the others, but they were confident it was only a matter of time before they pieced everything together. The gang had underestimated her, and now the law was closing in on them. But even with the added security and police involvement, Maria couldn't shake the lingering unease. Every time she stepped outside, she felt eyes on her. Every unfamiliar car passing by made her heart skip a beat. The fear didn't consume her, but it was always there, a shadow that followed her wherever she went. One evening, about a week after the break-in, Maria decided to take Duke for a walk. The air was crisp, the kind of coolness that hinted at the changing seasons. She needed to clear her head, to remind herself that the world wasn't entirely hostile. As they walked through the quiet neighborhood, Duke trotted happily beside her, his tail wagging. For the first time in days, Maria felt a sense of normalcy returning. The simple act of walking her dog felt like a small victory, a reminder that she was still in control of her life. But as they turned the corner onto a less traveled street, Maria spotted a familiar car parked along the curb. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the same dark sedan, its tinted windows obscuring whoever was inside. She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. Duke sensed her tension immediately, his body stiffening as he let out a low growl. For a moment, Maria considered turning around, retreating to the safety of her home. But something inside her refused to give in to that instinct. She had spent too long living in fear. She pulled out her phone, pretending to check a message as she snapped a photo of the car. If they were watching her, she'd make sure they knew she wasn't backing down. She didn't approach the vehicle, but she didn't hurry away either. Instead, she walked past it with deliberate calm, her eyes fixed straight ahead, Duke keeping pace beside her. The car didn't move. It stayed parked as she walked further down the street, its presence a silent reminder that this wasn't over. When she got home, Maria sent the photo to the police, along with a description of where she'd seen the car. She knew it might not lead to anything, but she wasn't about to let them intimidate her into silence. The following morning, she received a call from one of the officers handling her case. They had traced the car and identified the owner, a known associate of Scarface. The officer assured her that they were closing in on the gang and that her vigilance was making a difference. Hearing those words was a turning point for Mariah. She realized that while she couldn't control everything, she could take steps to protect herself and contribute to the fight against the people who had threatened her. She wasn't powerless, and she wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to normal. The gang's activities dwindled as law enforcement cracked down on their operations. Maria's neighborhood felt safer, the lingering tension gradually easing. One evening, as she sat on her porch with Duke at her side, she reflected on everything that had happened. The fear, the chaos, the moments when she had doubted her own strength. It had all tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. But through it all, she had stood her ground. She reached down to scratch behind Duke's ears, his tail thumping against the porch. "We did it, boy," she said softly. "We made it through." Duke looked up at her, his eyes full of loyalty and understanding. He had been her constant companion, her protector, and her reminder that she wasn't facing anything alone. Maria knew the memories of that dark time would stay with her, but they didn't define her. They were a chapter in her story, one that had shown her just how resilient she could be. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Maria felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in weeks. The world wasn't perfect, and danger would always exist, but she had found her strength, and that was something no one could take away. With Duke by her side and her own determination lighting the way, she knew she could face whatever came next.